Hello, this is episode 4 of New Uses for Old Circuits, Studies in Linear and Nonlinear Systems. So far, this series has been a little bit scattershot, but I've been trying to build towards something, which is namely the use of nonlinearities and chaos in the synthesizer. In the first video, we looked at slope generators and using them as low-pass filters. And this was more or less just a way to get our brains back into using things like slope generators in ways that might not be obvious at first, but exploit the flexibility of the circuit itself. In the second video, we looked at the work of Eliane Radigue. It was a bit of a reactive video to her passing, but given her work is such a driver of this channel, given that her sound world is so important for the kinds of things that I'm trying to explore in this channel, I wanted to dive into her process and how she uses modulation processes and sort of cascades them and feeds them back on themselves to create immersive sound fields. And in the third video, Sources of Inversion, we made perhaps the most boring synthesizer video on YouTube by going through every module in the Surge synthesizer and trying to figure out which modules, which signal processors invert their output and which don't. This is going to be really useful in the future when we kind of have to create large patches and figure out where inversions, phase cancellations, things like that might be happening in the system. But it wasn't the most thrilling video on the planet. This is also probably not going to be the most exciting video ever. It's not going to produce incredible sounds. But I want to, with this video, start to lay the groundwork for understanding what the words linear and nonlinear mean. There are all sorts of mathematical definitions for linear and nonlinear, and naturally, in the spirit of this channel, I'm not going to shy away from those, but I am going to try to present the ideas of linearity and nonlinearity in a way that should make sense to people comfortable using synthesizers. In my videos on cybernetics from a few years ago, we looked, using the model of a neuron, towards creating patches that could self-regulate, patches that could observe the system and change its state based on what certain circuits are observing. And a word I used a lot in that series was nonlinearity. The model of a neuron that we were working with requires nonlinear processes to function. And so in this video, we'll start to get a better understanding of what might be a linear process and what might be a nonlinear process. We're not going to go through the system and say this is a linear processor, this is a nonlinear processor, but rather we're just going to look at what the general idea of linearity and nonlinearity means so that later on, if we're kind of looking through a system that we design, we can say, oh yes, this is operating in a linear way, this is operating in a nonlinear way. And we can then exploit that knowledge to say, hey, maybe if I insert a nonlinear process here, something interesting will happen. I think the most important thing about this channel is that I want to create sounds. I do have an engineering and mathematics background, but I'm not looking to solve physics problems with my synthesizer. I'm looking to use some of the ideas from that and use them to maybe generate new sounds. Well, I'm looking to pull at threads from various disciplines, some more engineering and mathematically based, others more based in social sciences, and even still more based purely in an artistic realm. Also trying to look at things from the cutting edge of current research and also research trends from history that have been discarded. If you go back to Norbert Wiener's work on cybernetics, you'll find that the entire field is threaded with the thoughts of social implications of all this work, something which I find is sorely lacking from AI today. But more on that in another video. Let's start looking at linear and nonlinear systems. So what is a linear system? Well, first, how are we defining a system here? And what I'll say is basically a system is anything that's processing a signal. So anything that we plug a signal into and then come out of, that's going to be a system. So the most obvious thing would be something like a filter or an amplifier, something that takes in a signal and processes it in some way. In mathematical terms, a linear system is a system that satisfies two properties, the law of superposition and the law of homogeneity. Let's start with the law of homogeneity. That sounds like a pretty intimidating word, but in essence, it's pretty simple. Basically, any linear system, if it satisfies the law of homogeneity, is one where if we send a signal through the system, it doesn't matter if we scale the system before or after, the system will still act in the same way. What do I mean by that? Let's break into a concrete example, which I think will make it a lot clearer. Let's start with a saw wave and filter it. So we'll take a sawtooth, plug it through the variable Q filter, and then listen to the low-passed output. Let's also look at it on the scope. So does this filter satisfy the law of homogeneity? What that means is basically if we turn the volume down on the sawtooth going into the filter, that result should be the same as if we don't adjust the volume going into the filter, but instead adjust the volume coming out of the filter. So let's send this sawtooth wave through a voltage processor so we can adjust its volume going into the filter, just with a pretty basic volume knob. We also have a volume knob after the filter. And basically the law of homogeneity says that as I adjust these volumes, whether I'm adjusting the volume pre-filter or post-filter, the filter is going to react the same way. The filter doesn't care. It'll filter a low-level sawtooth wave coming in the same way that it'll filter a high volume sawtooth wave coming in that then has its volume turned down afterwards. The filter isn't changing how it filters the signal based on the gain of the signal coming in. Now, the variable Q filter does have its own independent gain stage, and some filters out there may use that gain stage to saturate or distort the signal, so that the resulting sound would change depending on the strength of the signal coming in. Let's do that really obviously by using the top section of the wave multiplier here, which will distort a signal. So instead of using this CV processor, let's use the top section of the wave multiplier. We will see that one change that happens is that since the wave multiplier is AC coupled, our resulting signal is now AC coupled, but that's okay. And for this, I'm actually going to change to the sine wave because I think that will let us hear the difference and it'll drive the idea home a little better. So we have our filter all the way open, and if we open our volume knob, we'll hear our sine wave going through the wave multiplier, and you'll hear that, especially if we put it in high mode, you'll hear it add a lot of harmonics as we raise the knob to the sine wave. We're not just changing the amplitude, but we're also adding harmonics through a kind of saturation. You can see the sine wave getting its shape getting a little changed as we adjust the volume here. We have this shape for our sine wave here, and as we reduce the volume going into the filter, you can hear the harmonics change, whereas if we reduce the volume after the filter, you see that we still have a lot of harmonics, we're just reducing the amplitude of the resulting signal. So this system is actually no longer linear, it's nonlinear because the different gain staging through this system is changing our result. The filter itself is still acting in a linear fashion, but we've replaced a clean amplifier for a sort of dirty one that's adding saturation. So we have a linear filter, but it's our amplifier here that's nonlinear. Let's look at a more extreme case of nonlinear amplifier, which would be the middle section of the wave multipliers, which is a wavefolder. Let's repeat this experimental setup that we were using before. Let's take our sine wave and first go through a mixer. And we know that this mixer is clean. It's not adding any harmonics or anything. Then we'll take the output of the mixer and go into our wave multiplier, and we'll take the output from our wave multiplier and go into our final mixer. So now the question is this circuit, the wavefolder, linear or nonlinear? If I cleanly adjust the volume of the input signal or the volume of the output signal, is my result still the same? I have a sine wave at full strength. If I reduce the volume of the sine wave by 50% going into the wave multiplier and then listen to the output, is that going to give me the same result as putting the full strength sine wave into the wave multiplier and then reducing the output by 50%. Let's turn up our volume here and see our wave folded sine wave. And now we see that as we're turning this volume up, we see it's the same wave folded shape, we're just adjusting the amplitude. But if we adjust the input volume, we're changing the signal itself. I'm not touching the wave multiplier control, I'm touching the input volume. And if I change the volume here, we get our more or less clean sine wave. But if I change the volume here on the input, I'm actually folding the signal. That's because the wave folder here, the middle section of the wave multiplier, is gain dependent. It reacts based on the volume of the incoming signal. Turning the control of the wave multiplier is essentially just cranking the volume of whatever is coming in really, really high, and then the wave folder folds it instead of clipping it like a normal distortion or saturation circuit would do. So by sending our input through this volume knob, we just basically have a second control to the same function. But at the end of the day, what we see is a nonlinear system in action, one where changing the input volume is not the same as changing the output volume. Another interesting case study in the Surge is the Resonant EQ. If you've done any music production, you have probably subconsciously banked on the fact that EQs are linear systems, that if you insert an EQ anywhere in your signal chain, you can reasonably assume that it shouldn't cause any nonlinearities in your system. The EQ shouldn't necessarily be coloring the resulting signal differently if a snare drum coming into it, for example, is played louder or softer. The Surge Resonant Equalizer, of course, is no normal equalizer, and its use of feedback throughout its design inherently creates lots of nonlinearities. Let's go into the Resonant Equalizer and out of the Resonant Equalizer. And let's use a more interesting signal than the sine wave. Let's use a pulse wave. And we can adjust frequency bands. And with some aggressive feedback settings, we'll see that right now if we change the output volume, we simply increase or decrease the volume of our resulting signal. But if we change the input volume, something else entirely is happening. Changing our input. Changing our output. So here with the Resonant Equalizer, we have a very clearly nonlinear system. The other important property of a linear system is the law of superposition. Now, demonstrating this law is pretty tedious on a synthesizer, so I'm just going to explain it so that we know what it is going forward. But the law of superposition is another pretty simple one. Let's say we have two different sounds, two sounds from our dual PCO. And we mix them together and send them through the variable Q filter and listen to the result. We filter the signal a little bit. The result of that should be the same as taking each signal independently, running it through its own version of the variable Q with the exact same settings, and then mixing them together after. So in editing this video, I realized that it's actually not that tedious to show the law of superposition. So I just wanted to make sure to show it real quick. So we basically just have two saw waves going through our simple mixer. Again, this mixer is very linear. It doesn't color the sound at all. And the output of that mixer is going to the variable Q filter with its cutoff frequency set halfway. And then we're listening to the output. So this is what the output sounds like. Which is, yeah, it's no great surprise, but the law of superposition basically says that this system, the filter, is a linear system if we make the following change and the result is exactly the same. So instead of taking the sawtooths and going to the mixer, we're going to take one sawtooth and go directly to the variable Q filter. And then we're going to take the second sawtooth and go to a second variable Q filter. Luckily, I have two in here, and the settings are basically exactly the same. Obviously, it's hard to tell. It's hard to say exactly the same, but for the most part, they're exactly the same. And we'll take the output of each filter, the low pass output at the top, and go to our mixer. The low pass output of the other one, go to channel 2 of the mixer, and then we'll listen to that. I need another patch cable. And now we'll listen to the mixed output, and we'll observe that we get the exact same result. This is probably not surprising to anyone, but just to reiterate, the law of superposition says that this filter is linear if mixing the two sawtooth waves before sending them into the filter, or filtering them both individually and then mixing them after gives us the same result. And it does. So this is just a little demonstration of the law of superposition. But so as we've seen, linear systems are systems that obey the principles of homogeneity and superposition. We've seen that even systems like the resonant equalizer can at times be linear and at times be nonlinear. We already know what this sound is sounding like and how nonlinear it is. Let's roll back the feedback. And if this is all pretty clean and tame, then the resonant equalizer, as you can see on the scope and hear with your ears, responds in a linear fashion. It's only when nonlinearities, through the use of feedback, begin to create nonlinearities in the system itself. The wave multiplier even, that was our kind of gold standard nonlinear processor. We know that if we take the sine wave and go into the wave multipliers and keep everything at a low volume, below the point where the signal will start to fold, then it's going to respond in a linear fashion. Here, if we keep this knob really, really low, we see that we don't yet hit the point of the wave folder where the wave starts to fold over. So right now, the wave multiplier is acting linearly. It's only when we bias this gain a bit more and we enter the point at where the wave starts to begin folding that it starts to function in a nonlinear fashion. And before we forget, let's look at the maybe simplest version of a nonlinearity in the system, which is the simple peak module here. We leaned on the peak pretty heavily as a source of nonlinearities in our previous series on cybernetics. But knowing what we know now, let's just show ourselves that that is in fact a nonlinear process. Let's take the sine wave and let's go into the input of the peak. And if we monitor the output of the peak, we'll see that, yes, what is the peak doing? It's chopping off everything below zero and only taking what's above. So if we look at the output of our sine wave, we get a sine wave that's bipolar, going positive and negative. And if we look at the output of the peak processor, we only get the positive portions of that signal. But if we don't use our bipolar sine wave, but instead use our unipolar saw wave, we'll see that whether we take it from the peak or directly from the source, our original source is only positive to begin with. The peak is not giving us the radical change that it did for the incoming bipolar signal. So the peak is another clear source of nonlinearity in the system.